I mean, I had just spent a year and a half in prison as part of the GI movement, and I had been interviewing everybody that came into Leavenworth Penitentiary who was a political prisoner, and so I had a clear sense. Plus, I had this guy who came in. He had killed his commander in Vietnam, and he was this incredible guy, African-American guy. Because I went into prison as a pacifist. But you know, you got nothing to do but sit around and talk and try and figure out what's the road forward. And there were two influences in Leavenworth. One was this guy who, a white guy who had been a student down in California somewhere, and he had gone into the stacks of the college that he was going to on his college deferment, and had found this book, which was the dispatches from Moscow, from the American embassy in Moscow, back in 1917 when they were having the revolution. And of course, the American embassy's job was to let the American government and the rulers that was like their eyes on the ground. And so it was the story of the Russian Revolution as told through the dispatches, the secret dispatches from the American embassy in Moscow. And they had subsequently been declassified, because now it was many years after that, and you know, after 50 years or whatever, or however many years, they declassified stuff, and it was declassified. And he had found this book of all these dispatches in the library, and you know, he was a student at Sacramento State or someplace or other, and he had like just gone wild with it, you know, and he spent all his time reading that book, and it just like blew his mind, you know, and he kind of like fell in love with the Russian Revolution. And even though he probably never met a communist in his life and anything like that, he became this intellectual communist. It's kind of hard to be a communist without a party. But, you know, he was like, read everything he could, and then he read everything else he could, and he was so busy reading that he forgot to go to class, and he got kicked out of school, and then the next thing you knew, he was drafted. And after he went to his training, and it was time for him to go to Vietnam, he refused to get on the airplane, and they didn't throw him on the airplane, but sent him to the judge, and he stood in front of the judge, and he told the judge, I refuse to get on the airplane because I refuse to go and kill my comrades because I'm a communist. You know, and at that point he still hadn't had any contact with any kind of left organization. He was like this intellectual, but he'd been won over to the notion of the revolution and, you know, serve the people and all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't that hard to kind of go in those directions in those days, because, you know, the Panthers were out there selling red books on the street corners, and people were kind of liking Ho Chi Minh and whatever. So anyway, he refused to go, and he got 5 years, the maximum sentence. And so I met the guy in Leavenworth, and so he and I would talk. And of course, and the question was, what's the hope for mankind? How are we going to move things forward? And I would argue that we had to get everybody to become pacifists and that kind of thing. And he'd say, well, you know, they've been trying that for a couple thousand years, hadn't worked. And his argument was that people should be revolutionaries, just they should be communists. And kind of arguing it from an intellectual, you know, position, but still. But then I had this other guy that came in. He'd killed his commander in Vietnam, African American guy who quickly formed like a black prisoners union and that kind of thing. And he had memorized the whole Red Book, you know, Mao's little Red Book. And he could. There's this history. I mean, there's this tradition in the African American community that modern rap is sort of like the latest incarnation of, I suppose. It was called signifying. Signifying was kind of a poetic way to tell stories, and it was sort of comes out of the oral history or oral tradition, and so this guy could signify Mao's Red Book. It's like this incredible guy had memorized the whole thing, and he could sit there and kind of chant it out, you know, just like a rapper would do today. He could signify. Now, most signifying stories in those days were. Because I got to hear lots of them, because you know, in the cell block there, you know, everybody get to hear everything, and you know, most of them were like the sexual adventures of a monkey, or you know, just some kind of bullshit. But this guy could signify the Red Book, and he had a profound impact on me, you know, because and it kind of went from being a pacifist to a more political kind of a person. I realized that wasn't good enough to protect your own personal soul, you know, and make my place in heaven by not being a bad guy, but that, you know, the issue was really humanity, and you know, we had to do whatever it took, and even if I had to give up my own little ticket to heaven in order to get humanity to a better place, that the horrors that were going on against the Vietnamese and the other political issues, you know, racism and stuff that were pressing hard against the American public. But those were issues that were worth really, being an activist for.